What about the situation on the battlefront then? If we talk military for a second, the Russians launched hundreds of drones, I think, over the past 2 days, upwards of 10 people, I think.
Russia does this, and it's what they do to try to continue to capture headlines and say that they're destroying Ukraine because they do these attacks on a nightly basis. And I don't want to dismiss the human toll of the attacks. They're horrible. But for a country at war, these attacks are just a drop in the bucket. I mean, compare it to World War II, when entire cities were being firebombed on a regular basis, and that alone didn't defeat. And so you asked about the frontline situation. I think Russia lashes out when they're feeling desperate, and they're clearly feeling desperate on the front. The casualty rates are some of the highest they've ever been, and that's even without the meat waves, because Russia's men are being killed before they can even get to the front and coordinate the meat waves, because Ukraine has started to increase their mid-range drone strike capabilities.
This is the Global Gambit.
Speaking of Russia, we've obviously had a very, I think a revealing few days, couple of weeks, a week, 10 days for Kremlin. We can get in a little bit maybe to the war itself, the heinous amount of strikes on Ukraine. But what about what Putin said? Let's just start with that, actually. He said, I think that the war in Ukraine is winding down. Oh, sorry, he didn't say war. The SMO is winding down.
Yeah, I don't know whether to believe Putin's comments on the surface, but I think the fact that he had to say that is significant. So he might personally still want to just fight the war for as long as possible, but he knows he has to signal to his people that the war is winding down. And that tells me that Putin knows that the Russian population is getting exhausted. This is similar to a comment Putin made, I think it was at the beginning of last year, I don't remember the exact timing, about Russia's economy. Where he acknowledged finally that there was, some economic damage and that they would be lowering the military budget the following year. I should follow up on that. I don't think the military budget actually got lowered, but he did have to signal to the Russian people that it was going to be, because he knew that there was damage. And so it does show some cracks within Russian society. They're not descending into revolt right now, but the background noise and how bad things are getting and how bad things are felt by the average Russian person, it's become undeniable, and Putin himself has to acknowledge it. That's what I take out of that comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get too carried away in thinking that this means it's Putin's V-Day or whatever, like he's finally had a moment of revelation. But he doesn't have to say that. And the timeliness, I think, the coinciding with the Victory Day, which was no heavy armored vehicles, no heavy equipment, whatever the collective word for it is, right? Nothing. And yeah, the Russians are floating that they've tested a new intercontinental ballistic missile, I think it was.
They do that every time they feel weak.
But like the fact that they have to project power through this bravado move, the fact that they also have such a reduced VD Day, which is all about projecting power and a show of confidence and patriotism in the country. And then Putin says that, Freudian slip there. I don't know, strange, don't you think?
It is. Even the mainstream media since Victory Day has finally been catching the plot. They have been releasing more and more articles just all over the place about how Ukraine is turning the tide, which is very strange for mainstream media. I've been talking for years, obviously, about how Ukraine is doing far better than most people think. But the mainstream media, pretty much this entire time I've had my channel, has always just been so cautious about Ukraine. They're like, oh, Pokrovsk is about to fall. And Russia, once they take Pokrovsk, all of Ukraine is going to be threatened. Ukraine can't do anything about it. I haven't seen those articles in a long time, but now we're seeing a lot of articles like, hey, Ukraine is actually, they're starting to push Russia back, and there's not much Russia can do about it. And that does come again off the back of that Victory Day parade, because I think everybody could tell that Russia was weak just by looking at the parade. I mean, this is what these countries do. China, Russia, North Korea, countries like them, they project strength that they don't have in parades. The parade is always a much stronger version of themselves than exists in reality, because the projection of the strength is the strength. So the fact that Russia couldn't even project strengths in their parade, it's like, how much weaker are they really? Because there's always a deficit between the strength that's projected in the parade and what actually exists. So it's huge.
Yeah, that's just what surprised me about Trump. Well, surprised me. Sorry, let me rephrase that. That's what completely didn't surprise me about Trump when he did his military parade in Washington last year, right? He wants so much to try to emulate these strong men. And I had a really interesting conversation with Tom Nichols of The Atlantic yesterday because he's written some very, I think, insightful pieces about Russia, the state of Putin's mind. He co-writes often with Anne Applebaum, and she's obviously a very notable voice on sort of autocratic tendencies. And the thing that he emphasized to me, and I was curious what you think, is what do you think changed for Putin? Clearly, he underwent a mindset shift in COVID. He was paranoid, and clearly he felt like he should just do something radical. And therefore decided or committed to this idea of war with Ukraine.
I've heard somebody talk about this, about how isolated Putin was during COVID because he was terrified. And of course, when Putin's isolated, it's not like us in our apartments or our flats, as you silly people across the pond call them.
It's nice.
Putin's isolated in these historical palaces, just so rich with Russian history, and the palaces themselves are an effort in propaganda to show Russia's strength for what it's worth and all its might. And so Putin's isolated in these huge historical buildings, looking over the history of Russia. He's going through the archives, I've heard, during COVID, and just researching Russian history. And I really think that could have triggered something in him, like a delusion of grandeur. Like, I'm going to do this and it's going to be easy. He wasn't planning for a long war. Everybody acknowledges that. And so I think that was part of it. And if you try to put yourself in that situation, like as a human being, it's actually kind of understandable how that would happen, especially if you already were a dictator and you'd been in power for decades, how you could get to that point, when you're in that kind of isolation and just around all these historical buildings and things of that sort.
Yeah, another I've chatted with and respect a lot is Mark Galliotti, and we debated a long time ago now, but this idea that Putin's had different phases. There's been different versions of Putin over time. The version of Putin, not denying that is he sort of inherently trustworthy or a good person, no, but he was maybe a softer version in the early 2000s. He did make some efforts with engaging NATO. I'm not again going down that rabbit hole, but and then over time, when he almost lost in the snow revolution of 2012, Crimea, and then COVID, there's been lots of things, inflection points, which have changed his outlook or approach to governing and centralizing that control or getting more paranoid. So, and now we're in this latest version. But I mean, to me, he looked pretty just rattled in his general demeanor at the parade, like when he was giving his speech. He reminded me of when he gave that speech when he first launched the war into Ukraine. When he's sitting there, his face looked very similar. Like he was enraged. He clearly wasn't completely just content inside. I don't know. Maybe you disagree, but I thought it wasn't. I don't know. He looked pretty unnerved.
It's that old cliche, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there's a reason, like in the United States and most democratic countries, we have term limits, because Putin, who's been in power for 2 decades, is very different from Putin, who's been in power for 2 months. First of all, there's just the human progression of, as humans, we're never satisfied. We always have to feel like we're growing. That's especially true of somebody with the ambition to reach the top level of government in their country. And where do you go from there? And so when you sit in that for decades, that's why you become increasingly more narcissistic, more megalomaniac. I don't know the right word there, but you become more dramatic. That certainly happened to Putin. We can certainly see a progression, especially after he got so much positive public approval when he invaded Crimea and took it so easily. This is not just Putin. I mean, we can look at this with Trump too. A lot of conservatives who really liked Donald Trump during his first term really don't like Trump during his second term. And that's because, there was a massive psychological shift in Trump between term 1 and 2. It's not like he was the most likable guy in the first term, but what he was doing then wasn't nearly as dramatic as what he's doing now. Maybe he flirted with the idea of leaving NATO or things like that. But he didn't just come out the gate tariffing all of our allies, cutting off military support from our allies and things like that. He was a little more level-headed, but I think, as he spent more time in power, it got more to his head. And that's pretty clear to see. And so it's a trait we can see across any leader, and that is why we have to be so cautious in our societies about letting any one person hold on to power for too long.
Absolutely, I completely agree. It's terrifying. It's sort of what we said in earlier on China and the US, that the choice of more centralized form of governance, but there's more economic stability, or you have more democratic freedoms, but you put up with the economic unpredictability because you get different people in and they want to change what the previous administration or government did. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I'm interested in your thoughts on, I don't know if you saw this in the news or what the Russians announced is this Sarmat missile. I alluded to it earlier, but they launched what the Russians call this RS-28, and Putin has boasted that it goes far beyond what the West assumes it can. This is the most powerful missile in the world, he said on Tuesday. I'm just reading here, adding that the combined power of its individual targeted warheads is more than 4 times that of its Western counterparts. It's called Satan II in the West. This is the Intercontinental ICBM I was referencing. What's your take on this? Anything to worry about?
Who cares? We've had ICBMs and mutually assured destruction for decades. When my grandparents, when my parents were my age, certainly the world could have been destroyed many times over by the weapons that existed. So what does adding more power to a nuclear weapon system, add to that equation? It adds nothing, because already if Russia fires a nuke, I don't care how advanced the Sarmat is, if it's more advanced than anything we have in the United States, we're going to fire back and we're both going to be totally destroyed. And there's a reason we never engaged in nuclear war, because all sides realized that was futile and stupid. The point of these, occasional releases by Russia, this isn't the first one. They've done this throughout the war. I mentioned earlier in the video, every time they feel desperate, they do another nuclear test. They reveal some new wonder weapon, which may or may not even exist. That is totally just an effort in propaganda to terrify people and remind them that Russia has nukes, basically, because they see that as their trump card. Nobody will push against them if they're afraid of Russian nukes. And to be fair, at the beginning of the war, they were totally correct about that. Ukraine lost a lot of support that maybe they otherwise would have had, because people were terrified of Russia's nukes. And so whether or not you're afraid of Russia's nukes, people can make their own decision. I obviously have my thoughts on that. I just don't think that this new weapon adds literally anything to that equation.
No, it doesn't really. It's a good point that we've had MAD for a long time. We've had so much around efforts to recognize non-proliferation and NPT and that sort of those sorts of multilateral efforts. And it goes back to something which I don't really like to say, because I like to imagine that there's more that Russia could have offered the world. But simply, you see a lot of these types of countries, they put a lot of emphasis on their hard power. And it's the debate around, is Russia a great power or not? And people argue that, you strip away the nuclear weapons and it's a very large state. But other than that, does it have the capacity to exercise soft power? That's something that China's been doing in recent years, is really emphasizing soft power and cultural ties in a way that Russia just doesn't. And there was a report, I think, in the BBC this morning I was reading about a Russian militia group that is going around harassing women, especially who are holding particular types of parties, or just what they consider to be disruptors. So that the mafia state of Russia, the bully, the thug element of Putin's government style and model, very much on display there. And I think that this absurd, demonstration or publicity around the missile is what about the Oreshnik? Is that now out of date? I mean, I thought the Oreshnik was the greatest thing ever. So I don't know if it seems to go anywhere with this, but I don't know. What about the situation on the battlefront then? If we talk military for a second, the Russians launched hundreds of drones, I think, over the past 2 days. It's killed upwards of 10 people, I think.
Yeah, Russia does this, and it's what they do to try to continue to capture headlines and say that they're destroying Ukraine, because they do these attacks on a nightly basis. And I don't want to dismiss the human toll of the attacks. They're horrible. Whenever an innocent civilian dies, one civilian, that's horrible. But for a country at war, these attacks are just a drop in the bucket. I mean, compare it to World War II, when entire cities were being firebombed on a regular basis, and that alone didn't defeat either side. What Russia's doing in comparison to that is almost nothing. And even if we compare, the casualties that are caused by these, Russian attacks in Ukrainian cities to how many people probably die of car crashes in Ukraine on a regular basis. Again, every death sucks, but it's just to put it in context of these are unnecessary deaths, but they're not casualties that are even close to something that's going to break Ukraine. And so you asked about the frontline situation. I think similar to the Sarmat missiles or the Satan II, I think I said it wrong, but similar to all these new missiles, Russia lashes out when they're feeling desperate, and they're clearly feeling desperate on the front. The casualty rates are some of the highest they've ever been, and that's even without the meat waves, because Russia's men are being killed before they can even get to the front and coordinate the meat waves, because Ukraine has started to increase their mid-range drone strike capabilities, where they can very regularly and efficiently and affordably strike targets between 100 and 300 kilometers beyond the front line. And so basically all of occupied Ukraine is now the front line. Russian soldiers are not safe anywhere. The logistics routes are being taken out, deeper and deeper, and it's just really not looking good for Russia. They certainly do not at this moment seem capable of actually coordinating enough forces to take territory from Ukraine at this point, at least not significant enough to make a difference.
No, I that's one of the things that I read in various publications or the podcasts or whatever, the people that we speak to on the show. But if we'd had this conversation in December, January, we would have been, I think, a lot gloomier, because the situation did look quite tough. The winter was probably the hardest for the whole war. But 3 months on, I mean, you could even say as early as March, that tide really has shifted. And the war in Iran, I think, has been a huge element to that. Zelensky, for better or for worse, he has been trying very hard to ensure that Ukraine remains relevant or in the news cycle, but in a way that he's playing to the self-interests of the Gulf states. He's trying to sort of engage, for lack of a better word, Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel, even the Turks. Ukraine's been pressuring Turks with trying to help with drone interceptors because they had incursions in the first couple of weeks. So yeah, quite an impressive display of diplomatic statecraft, in my opinion. But whether or not that's taken up, I think, remains to be seen. Certainly, fortunes have shifted, and the more that the economy of Russia just completely disintegrates, versus also now he doesn't even have the military angle to say, is going swimmingly, because it's not. 6 months ago, Russia maybe had the momentum, whatever that means. But now it just looks pretty bleak for Moscow and the Russian forces, right?
It's horrible. It makes me curious to check out some of these Russian bloggers who they used to always respond to my videos, make clickbait, and like, Russia's advancing. These guys like Paul Warburg don't know what they're talking about, and like every one of my predictions has turned out correct. I look at least all the major ones that they were saying I was wrong about. I want to see what they're actually saying now. I actually don't know what the Russian propagandists are saying now to say that they're still winning the war and things are going so well. I know a lot of Russian bloggers for the first time have turned against Putin, and that's a huge development, because I think at some point even they have to acknowledge, like, dude, there's no good news to share. There's just none. Even if it's not, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Even if things are not as rosy for Ukraine as I may portray in my videos, as they would say, like, there's nothing good for the Russians to point at all that I can think of.
No, there isn't. I mean, what? No, I'm trying to think very candidly, audience. What is there?
I don't even see the trolls in my comments anymore.
No,
it's like they've given up. I mean, there's still like those one or two guys, but
no, that's a shame. But you're getting less engagement now. I'm kidding, but no, that is true. Actually, I do see less of it. I mean, I think a lot of attention, the bots have had to be reallocated towards Iran, Israel, and all that sort of stuff, right? Even bots have a life cycle. I don't know. Yeah. So, what about therefore? Where do you see this going? Like, I mean, we chatted a couple of weeks back, but do you think anything big is going to come in the next couple of weeks, or not really?
A couple of weeks now. By the end of the year, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some massive changes, but I still don't see an imminent end to the war. I just still see a progressive decline. But at some point, that progressive decline will be enough to maybe shock even me at how quickly things develop. Things are going in a particular direction right now. So I think Russia will be defeated. I don't know exactly what that'll look like, but no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, let's back up a second. What about this whole idea of a coup? I mean, I think it's preposterous, if I'm honest, as much as I'd like to see Russia without Putin. The idea that Shoigu, of all people, was leading a coup, I think is absurd. I mean, I'll lay out why very crudely, and then you can, tell me why I'm wrong or whatever. But Shoigu is first and foremost one of Putin's closest associates. They go back to childhood, as far as I'm aware. Second, Putin already sidelined him by putting him in the National Security Council or whatever it is, out of the MOD. So he's lost a lot of influence and ability to command any such thing. But thirdly, he's an idiot. I mean, relative to Putin, he's not some grand strategist with some capacity for scheming behind the scenes. Okay, he's not a complete idiot. He's not Trump's level, but he's not. For me, he lacks certain depth and vision. He lacks the capacity to bring together and oversee what would be required. That's why, as much as the mutiny in 23 by the Wagner Group was a big deal, it wasn't actually going to lead to a coup. They didn't actually want to overthrow Putin. It was more just a show of, we want to show that we're dissatisfied and stuff. You're not going to overthrow the Russian state with 20,000 forces. So, I don't know. I find it very overhyped, if I'm honest. But what's your thoughts?
It could happen. I don't know if or when it will happen. I never want to confuse.
I'm not saying it can't happen. I just found this particular version was rather.
Sure. When somebody gets specific with the name, I'm always skeptical, because if you know the name, of course Putin does, and so it's already dead. It's already dead in the water, right?
That's a good point.
Just being clear there, but don't confuse capacity with intent. Sometimes the most incompetent people are the most sure of themselves, as we've all seen in politics lately. So it's entirely possible that somebody totally incompetent is plotting a coup against Putin, because these guys are all where they are for the same reason. They're corrupt. They want power. They want money. There's a reason they get sidelined, and it's not because Putin's not afraid of them. It's because he is. That said, a coup can happen in a lot of formats. It doesn't have to be literally taking Putin out of power. It could just be diminishing loyalty to Putin, where he can't exercise his decrees. If you have a coup within the military leadership and they just don't want to enact Putin's vision of the war, and they want to just enrich themselves, that's equally devastating for Russia, just on a slower burn rate. And I would argue, it's possible that's already happened. We see the stunning incompetence of the Russian military and how much individual commanders have turned away from trying to win the war, where it seems like they're just trying to make money on the war, taking bribes to not send their soldiers to the front or whatever, and then sending them anyways so that nobody knows that they took the bribe. There's so many examples where the Russian military already isn't operating as a cohesive machine, but rather as a bunch of individual, money scams for the particular portions of it. That is potentially a more devastating coup for Putin than somebody literally taking his position of power. And if that's happening in the military, of course it's probably happening in the economy, and the people who own Russian oil and natural gas and other minerals and things of that sort. So something to watch.
No, for sure. And aside from that, Paul, so much more to watch. The economy, meh. I will probably be trying to make something next week on Russia's view of the Chinese-US thing, because I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's worth thinking through.
I've always long meant to do a video on the reality of China's-Russia relationship, but then I get distracted by something else. But yeah, lots to work on, as you do, in a fantastic basis. Everyone, though, Paul Warburg, it's always a pleasure with you, my friend. Yeah, I look forward to seeing what you produce, and look forward to doing this again. As always, we do it on a reoccurring basis, I guess. I sort of text you earlier in the week, and you're like, I was going to free on Tuesday, and then I forgot to reply, and then I'm like, Friday, yeah, okay, let's do it on Friday, and now we do it. So that's really fun.
We're busy guys. It's okay. We'll make it happen when we can.
How's your little one? Is he?
He's doing well.
Yeah, good. No,
he's not out of the woods. Never is, but he's doing really well. So
he's managing all right. Good. No,
yeah,
to hear. But yeah, all right. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for watching. Do, of course, go over to Paul's videos if you haven't seen him before. Check it out. He does long, in-depth dives, even longer. I mean, some of your videos are like 45 minutes. I don't know how you do that. Talking, trying to
We've
keep
been going for 53 minutes right now, Pyotr. What are you talking about?
I have you to talk to. I can't just talk about myself. I'd nod off. All right. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. Do subscribe, do like the videos, and we'll see you all in the next one. Take care.